Hello, my name is Monika Witte. I'm a master gardener in Contra Costa County, and I'm here today to talk with you about growing one of my favorite vegetables, sweet potatoes. Today I will talk about why you might want to grow sweet potatoes, a little bit of perspective, what they are and why they're important, the timeline for planting them, and some problems and solutions. There are some pictures in the slides that I'm going to share with you today that were taken at the Master Gardener demonstration garden in Walnut Creek. And they were taken over the past 2 years. The photos that were taken in 2019 were not wearing masks. And the photos that were taken in 2020, we are wearing masks. And that's just so you know. So why would you want to grow sweet potatoes? Well, for one thing, they're delicious. Sweet potatoes are one of the world's most important food crops, now grown in more countries than any other root crop. And they're a vegetable that's enjoyed by many children and adults. And sweet potatoes are nutritious. In addition to containing simple starches, they have other micronutrients, they're rich in dietary fiber, and they produce actually more edible energy per acre than wheat, rice, or cassava. And what many people do not know is that sweet potatoes are completely edible. All parts of the plant are edible. So the greens, the stems may be sauteed just like any other leafy green, like spinach or kale, and you can also eat them raw in salads. They're also very easy to grow. They grow in marginal conditions, in drought and in heat, and they're not too picky about soil, so they're easy to grow. So first, a little bit of perspective. What is a sweet potato? A sweet potato is a tender, warm weather root vegetable. It requires a long frost-free growing season, and there are many varieties, as you see here, and a few of them are in the pictures. They're all generally the same size and shape, and they're native to Central and South America. Is a sweet potato a yam? No, it's not. And the confusion on this was perpetuated by the United States Department of Agriculture with their labels. The USDA traditionally labeled the form of sweet potato that has creamy white flesh as sweet potatoes and the form that has orange flesh as yams. And today, the USDA requires that the labels with the term yam be accompanied by the term sweet potato. However, there's still confusion. This is a photo from our local grocery store this year, recently actually, and you can see that the sweet potato bins are clearly labeled yams, even though the USDA in their own literature declares that yams need to be accompanied by the term yam needs to be accompanied by the term sweet potato. So if you're confused, you're not the only one. So what is a yam really? Yam is a common name for several plants in the Dioscorea family, which is a completely different plant family from sweet potatoes. There are many cultivated species of Dioscorea yams in the humid tropics. These are not generally available in the United States except in specialty markets. These Dioscorea yams are edible starchy tubers, so similar to sweet potatoes, and they sometimes have nearly black bark-like skin. They might be as small as regular potatoes or as large as 5 feet or more. Sweet potatoes are not true yams, and they're also not potatoes. Potatoes are in the Solanaceae family, along with tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants, some of our favorite summer vegetables. Sweet potatoes, on the other hand, are in the Convolvulaceae family, along with morning glories, bindweed, and many other plants. So you might be wondering, how do you spell sweet potato, one word or two? Well, the International Potato Center says one word, and this helps to differentiate the sweet potato from the white or Irish potato. On the other hand, many sources use 2 words to spell sweet potato, including the University of California and other universities. So they're not completely consistent. Sometimes 1, sometimes 2. I think you would be correct in spelling it either way. So let's talk about root vegetables. Root vegetables are underground plant parts that we eat. They are storage organs for the plant. They store carbohydrates as a form of energy. And they do that so that the plant does that so that they can withstand stress. So for example, there might be stress in the wintertime when it's really cold. There might be a lack of light even, or there might be a lack of water. And the plant uses the carbohydrates that are stored in the roots as a form of energy to support it when it's under stress. Root vegetables are important economically, especially those with a high carbohydrate concentration, such as sweet potatoes. And their importance actually overshadows cereals in tropical regions of the world. So something I did not know until I was preparing this talk is that the sweet potato can be a lifesaver. As I said, it's one of the world's most important food crops in certain parts of the world. It grows in marginal conditions and requires little labor and fertilizers. Sweet potatoes can be a cheap and nutritious solution for developing countries needing to grow more food. And sweet potatoes have a long history as a lifesaver. The Japanese used it when typhoons demolished their rice fields. Sweet potatoes kept millions from starvation in famine-plagued China in the early 1960s. And sweet potatoes came to the rescue in Uganda in the 90s when a virus ravaged their cassava crops. So what is a tuberous root? It's an enlarged fleshy root, tapered at both ends, and two examples are dahlia and sweet potato. And as I said, it's usually, the tuberous root in and of itself is usually a storage organ. The roots are produced on one side of the tuber and the shoots are produced on the other side. And we're going to be talking today about the shoots. So what about the flowers? Sweet potato flowers don't exist on the edible sweet potato plants that are commonly grown in the United States. They don't typically produce flowers. They may flower if their roots are restricted, such as when they are in too small of a container. Sweet potatoes are grown from slips, and the slips are cuttings from sprouted sweet potatoes. These can be purchased from a mail order source, but they may be difficult to locate. I did find some recently from seed companies online, so I know that you can find them, but as I said, they can be difficult. They sell out quickly. And sometimes they aren't shipped to California. But not to worry, you can grow them yourself. It's relatively easy, but it takes 12 weeks about. So let's get started. So first of all, you'll want to buy 1 or 2 organic sweet potatoes. They should be organic so that they haven't been treated with sprout inhibitors. You should select small or medium sweet potatoes that are well shaped without disease or injury. You'll need to simulate warm soil conditions indoors. I use a heat mat, but in any case, keep the sweet potatoes in a warm location about 75 degrees. No part of my house is 75 degrees, so I use a heat mat. Place the sweet potatoes in a well-drained container filled with 2 inches of sawdust or potting mix. What you see here are 2 plastic containers. They're just leftover containers from purchasing vegetables at a grocery store. I poked holes in the bottom and placed them on a cookie sheet, and that cookie sheet is then placed on top of a heat mat. And each sweet potato is buried about halfway. And then keep it moist. And be patient. Another option is to suspend the sweet potatoes in a jar of water. In this case, you'll want to use toothpicks in a jar, and the end where the sweet potato was originally attached to the mother plant needs to be up. So this can be hard to see. You'll have to look carefully to see which end originally has the scar and had the mother plant attached. Again, a heat mat is very helpful. When I tried this without a heat mat, I wasn't successful at all, and the picture doesn't show a heat mat. But my friend Diane uses a heat mat with this method and has been successful. So about 6 weeks later, this was the result of those 2 potatoes. And you can see here that one potato is much more productive than the other, but the one that was less productive caught up about a week later. So they were both very successful. At this point, when each sprout has 2 or more leaves and is a few inches long, you can break them off or snap them off and place each stem in water to root. When you break the stem off of the potato, you want to include as little as possible of the orange flesh of the sweet potato because that's where any pathogens might reside. So don't have any of that orange flesh in the part of the slip that gets potted up into the water. And when each green sprout in the glass of water has a collection of roots, then you can pot them up into 4-inch or gallon-sized pots. I always use gallon-sized pots because it's a little bit easier for me then to allow them to grow. If I don't get around to planting them immediately, then they can live in the larger pot for a little bit longer. They won't get root bound. My friend Diane, on the other hand, tends to use 4-inch pots. She keeps them in a greenhouse. That's how she protects them from the cool evening weather. I carry them in and out of the garage every night. Those 2 sweet potatoes that you saw produce these 39 slips. So that's pretty amazing. Even though some of them are so tiny you can't even see them, I guarantee that every one produced a plant that then gave us a crop of sweet potatoes. So it was very successful. So when the nighttime temperatures are warm enough, and that means the temperature is above 50 degrees and the soil has warmed to 65 to 70, which is about mid-May, then you can plant them out in the garden. So the first thing you want to do is incorporate about 1 inch of compost or a complete fertilizer into the top few inches of soil. Sweet potatoes are medium feeders. This is different from tomatoes, which are heavy feeders. They need a lot of nutrition to produce that enormous plant every season. And legumes, which on the other hand, give nitrogen back to the soil. Sweet potatoes are kind of in the middle. They're medium feeders. You should plant them 12 to 18 inches apart and keep the soil moist, especially during the first 2 to 3 weeks after you plant them until the vines are established. We recommend frequent irrigation until the vines are established. And that means once or twice a day, especially if it's warm, which it likely will be because at this point it's middle to end of May or even early June. So you'll have to decide where to plant them, and sweet potatoes need a place with a lot of sun. So this chart you probably have seen before if you've seen some of our other Master Gardener presentations this year. What we have said is that plants that we grow for their roots or flowers need 4 to 6 hours a day. And sweet potatoes are almost an exception to this. They're on the upper end. They want to have 6 to 10 hours of sun a day. And if you're having trouble finding that location in your yard, you might consider a grow bag, for example, which you can put in the sunniest location on a patio or someplace. My friend Nancy used a 30-gallon grow bag and grew one of those 39 pots that I showed you. One of those 39 slips is right here in the grow bag, and she produced this crop of sweet potatoes that you see on the slide. So that was very successful. You could also get something roughly the same size if you wanted, instead of a grow bag, just a firm container. This is about 16 inches deep and about 20 to 24 inches in diameter. So something to think about during the growing season is that you might not want to let the vines root at the nodes. So if the vines root along their length at the nodes, many sweet potatoes will form at those nodes. And the sweet potatoes that form at the main plant will also be smaller than they would be normally, and the yield may be decreased. So in order to prevent this, you can gently lift the plants to keep them from setting down roots along the vine. You could also train the vines up a trellis. This guideline is really if you want to grow prize-winning sweet potatoes. We actually didn't worry about the vines setting down roots at the demonstration garden, and the results were just fine. We let them go. We pretty much ignored them for the season until it was time to harvest, and there was no issue. So I think the guideline for not letting the vines set down roots is just for you prize-winning sweet potato growers. So something else to think about during the growing season is about 2 to 4 weeks before you harvest, you'll want to turn the water off in order to allow the skins to toughen up a little bit so that they can be a little bit tougher for the bruises they're going to see when they're harvested. So now what about harvest day? So 90 to 120 days after planting, or 3 to 4 months, you can harvest. And the truth is, you can harvest when the tubers are a size you prefer. They don't actually ripen in the same way that a tomato ripens. You can choose to harvest the sweet potatoes when they're the right size for you. You can also choose to harvest some maybe this week and then a few more in a few weeks. Just be careful that when you're digging the sweet potatoes out of the ground, that you don't damage the neighboring sweet potatoes. You'll certainly want to harvest before the soil temperatures drop to 55 degrees and before the first frost. And when you harvest, be careful. The tubers bruise and nick easily, and you'll be tempted to wash them off because they're very dirty. Don't do this because they'll get moist, and that'll be hard to dry off. So just brush off the dirt. They are beautiful when they're first harvested, but I can attest to this, they don't taste very good. The first year I grew sweet potatoes, I didn't believe it, and I brought them in, cleaned them up, prepared them and steamed them in the microwave and served them for dinner, and they did not taste good at all. So the truth is that they need some time to develop the sugar. Some of their starch converts to sugar during the storage. So for that sweet, moist taste that we prefer, you'll want to store them for several weeks in a warm, dry, well-ventilated area. So we used the greenhouse that you see here. We stored them in crates and put a shade cloth on top of them. It wasn't 80 degrees. Sweet potatoes want to be stored between 75 and 80 for a few weeks. We had this greenhouse that was warm, and it kept them warm at night. When I harvest sweet potatoes at my home, I bring them in the kitchen to be stored for the first couple of weeks. And thereafter, they need cool but not cold environment. So I put them out in the garage for storage for longer term, and they can be out there for 1 or 2 months or longer. And the longer they're out there, they'll continue to develop their sugar, so they'll just get sweeter and sweeter. So what do you want to plant next in the same bed? You may have heard, if you've listened to other Master Gardener talks this year, that you don't want to disturb the soil. Well, harvesting root vegetables necessarily disturbs the soil, and that affects the soil organic matter, the living things that are in the soil, the earthworms, etc. And there's really nothing you can do about that because you're harvesting a root vegetable. In order to help the soil recover, at this point, you want to plant a soil-building fall cover crop, such as Austrian peas, vetch, a mustard, or a clover. So what I show here is one bed with fava beans and vetch and some grasses, and another bed over on the right that has crimson clover, which is just a beautiful cover crop. That grows in full sun, but it's also a cover crop that you can grow if you have an area with partial shade. It's tolerant of shade. So I'll talk about problems and solutions. But before I get to problems and solutions, let's talk a little bit about the 4 foundations of success. So if you've seen some of our talks, you've seen this slide before. Soil is, of course, number 1. Soil is the basis for a healthy garden. Soil for a sweet potato plant, they're not too picky, but they prefer good drainage. And certainly they prefer the soil if it's not compacted. So protect your soil. Watering is always important. Consistent moisture is critical for all vegetables, including sweet potatoes. So that means that get to know your soil, understand when moisture is at the right level. And for sweet potatoes and all young plants, you'll want to take special care when they're getting established. Air in the soil is something that we tend to underappreciate. Air is necessary for roots to grow and for the living things in the soil to have enough air to breathe. So if you don't compact the soil, then there will be pore spaces, and that's necessary for plant growth. And lastly, sun. As I mentioned, sweet potatoes need full sun. So there are 3 categories of issues that I'm going to talk about: disease, insects, and rodents. So the best disease controls for sweet potatoes and other vegetables include fertile soil, crop rotation, and consistent moisture. Scurf is an issue that can result in black spots on the skin. If you find that you have scurf in your garden, you'll definitely want to rotate crops. I recommend rotating in any case, and remove any plant debris after harvest in order to remove any of the infectious material. Long stringy roots on your sweet potatoes instead of plump roots that we like, that's an indication of too much irrigation or poor drainage. If you have cracked or split sweet potatoes, that's an indication of excess irrigation after a dry period. We did have some cracked sweet potatoes in our demonstration garden this past year, and they were delicious nevertheless. Sweet potatoes are usually free from major pest infestations. Here are two that may be an issue. Flea beetles are very tiny. They're about 1/16 of an inch long, and they nibble at the foliage and at the stems and really don't create, the beetles themselves don't create much of a problem. Their larvae can attack both the foliage above ground as well as the root crop underneath. That can be a bigger issue. If you find that you have these, it will be very important to clean up the vegetable bed at the end of winter so that you don't have any overwintering beetles. Wireworms are more likely in our area. The click beetle is the adult form of the wireworm. It's about 1/4 of an inch long. It's a little bigger than the flea beetle and a different color and shape, as you can see. The adult form of it, although it may nibble on the foliage above ground, they don't really cause a big problem. The problem is caused by the wireworms underground, and they can eat holes in the plant. The wireworms are about 1/4 to 1/2 an inch long. The adult is about 1/4 inch. There are several species of those wireworms that feed on sweet potatoes. The adults, as I said, are click beetles, and they don't weaken the plant. The larvae can live for several years in the soil. The entire life cycle, actually, of the click beetle and wireworm is 3 to 4 years, and most of that time is spent in the larva form. In order to remove these from your garden, you can bait them. They are attracted to, the wireworms are attracted to pieces of carrot or potato, so you can stick them onto a flag, for example, here, and put them in the bed. And the wireworms are attracted then to that small piece of carrot or potato, pull it up, rinse it off, and put it right back in the bed. You can put those maybe every 6 inches and substantially reduce the population of wireworm in your bed. And if you're patient, you can hand pick the beetles that are above ground. The picture that you see here with all of those holes is not a picture that I took because I forgot to take a picture when I saw them. We only had 1 or 2 holes in our potato, in just a few of our potatoes, so we didn't have a big problem. But nevertheless, any problem is annoying, and so I want to not have that next year. So rodents can also be a problem. As I mentioned earlier, all parts of the sweet potato plant are edible, and the squirrels have figured this out. They will demolish the sweet potato vine. This happened to me last year. And so what I did at that point was protect the plant with a cage and allow the plant to grow back. Once the foliage gets bigger and a little bit tougher, I removed the cages so that they could spread. Voles can also be a problem. Voles, the way to protect them is by protecting the plant from underneath. These plants that you see here are in a raised bed, and there's chicken wire at the bottom of the raised bed. I would not be able to plant sweet potatoes in my garden in the ground because I have a pretty substantial gopher and vole problem in my garden. That wouldn't work. So a little bit more information. Each sweet potato produces many slips. So what you see here is a bed that's 5 feet wide by 20 feet long. So it's a 100 square foot bed. And the year this photo was taken, we planted 50 slips in that bed and produced 250 pounds of sweet potatoes. So it's pretty amazing what you can produce with very little to start with. It's just amazing. So in summary, I'd like to give you a timeline for growing the sweet potato slips. First, get started by buying some and placing them into a rooting medium or water. 5 or 6 weeks later, break off the sprouts and place those into a jar with water to root. In a few weeks, 2 weeks after that, pot up those rooted sprouts into 4-inch or larger pots with some potting soil. And about 4 weeks later, longer if it's a gallon size and shorter if it's 4-inch, plant it in the garden when the soil and air temperatures are warm enough. And so the total time from purchase to planting out in the garden is about 12 weeks. So in summary, sweet potatoes are easy to grow and can provide an excellent source of nutrition for your family. You'll want to start slips in the window from mid-February to mid-March. Harvest when the sweet potatoes are a size you prefer, but before the soil cools down to 55 degrees and before the first frost. And be sure to cure them for a few weeks to a month to allow the sugars to develop. I have a couple of links here if you'd like to learn a little bit more, either for sweet potato culture or regarding some of the pests that we talked about. And if you are interested in more information, the Master Gardeners of Contra Costa County have a terrific website with quite a bit of information that's available, a list of the upcoming webinars, and lots of links to different information on growing both vegetables and ornamentals in your garden. You can follow us on social media, and if you live in Contra Costa County, email our help desk with your gardening questions, and they will respond with brilliant answers. So I want to thank you. I hope some of this information was helpful to you today.